the beauty of such images that decorate the sides or the upper or lower parts of the map. At the end of the presentation 2 weeks ago, we basically reviewed these images with me emphasizing the significance of such decorations on the visual language by means of which Europeans came to represent China at the end of this particular century and later. Now, this is where we stopped with Michael Boym, if my memory serves me right. This was a Polish Jesuit father who produced quite a few significant and interesting texts, the most important of which is going to be was dedicated to plants in China. It's visually stunning, and we're going to take a quick look in a short while. Before this is one of his lesser known texts dedicated to Chinese medicine. Basically, he in this Latin text edited by this German gentleman in 1682, we find such obviously Chinese-inspired representations of the human body. They are quite stunning, some of them. They look like this. I think that I showed some of them to you last week or 2 weeks ago. They obviously get inspiration from the usual Chinese representations of the human body at that time. It is, however, exciting to notice the attempt of the graphic artist to represent a Chinese person here in a book dedicated to Chinese medicine. You have all sorts of images like this. Their impact, that is, beautiful written signs or letters. Of China or about China in Europe cannot be really gauged. I don't know if it was large or not. Still, it's kind of interesting to look at them and go through each and every one of them. Now, we can go on analyzing each and every one of them, but it's through words and images. At a later point in our class, in fact, we'll also find with a Jesuit father by the name of Athanasius Kircher, words and images, or rather word images, different from Apollinaire's own word images, but not less beautiful. But we'll talk about this much, much later in our course. Chinese characters, how the character for men is produced by the two other strokes and so forth. This is Flora Sinensis. This is one of the most interesting books printed in Europe in the second half of the century. It is interesting because, well, it contains illustrations like this one, and on the left-hand side of the book and on the right-hand side you have the Latin text describing the actual fruit or vegetables, or as you will see, animals as well included in the text. There is an attempt at, as you notice, at representing the Chinese names of the plants themselves. This would be a, go ahead.
Sorry, is the PPT on the,
no.
The PDF on here? No?
No.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is a continuation of last week's, of 2 weeks ago, right? So I uploaded only the what we discussed, right? Well, it's not quite a half, it's like 1/3 or so, right? So from this moment on, we are exploring new territory, okay? So we have plant after plant being represented to European eyes. All these images were enormously influential. They would be repeated and we would see their impact on later texts as we advance in the century. I will slowly move from one to another. Some of these plants are probably, or they should be, familiar because we are in Taiwan. Now try to imagine yourself as a 17th century European who had no idea what this was about, who must have been stunned both by what he saw, by the very vivid colors representing these particularly exotic examples of flora, and also by, well, the Chinese characters with their Latin transcription next to them. We have quite a few of them. Let me see which ones I should dedicate a bit more time to. That would be pineapple. That would be, well, mango, I think. Pipa. That, from here on, I just decided to keep the images and not the Latin text. This combination of languages in and of itself is very, very interesting. It represents an attempt at domesticating, making yours the exotic knowledge brought from across the world. Other plants, more and more colorful, more and more beautiful. Finally, we have pepper with, you notice the characters, you notice the description, and finally, birds. Now we are here already at a very, very exciting place because that would be a phoenix, as you notice, right? Next to the phoenix, we would have a simple, well, hen or chicken. And then we are moving to even fancier animals like, well, a squirrel. Apparently the Chinese squirrel is more of a squirrel than a European squirrel. This particular representation would appear in many, many other texts a bit later. And finally, hippos, right? Very smiling ones. They seem for no good. As all teachers constantly tell you, I'm sure, rightfully or not, don't trust Wikipedia too much. Still, in this particular case, I find the synthesis here quite accurate. It is represented kind of, recognizable. You can read if you try. You have the transcription over here. So we are moving into very, very interesting territory. I'm not going to tell you what this is. This is at the very end of the book. It's basically an image of a monument discovered in China, which gave a lot of enthusiasm to the Jesuits about the presence of Christianity before their time, in earlier times in China. But I won't dwell into it because the discussion is going to be too long. Now, we stopped last week with the very first list of names. The most important of names on that list were those of the Italian Martino Martini and of the Polish Jesuit Mikhail Boym. Now we are moving to a new list of names that includes quite a few very, again, important names of scholars and scientists, all of them Jesuit, active either in China or in Europe. The list starts with one Italian father by the name of Prospero Intorceta, who together with his teacher and several other Jesuits started to produce translations of the Chinese classics, what they call the Chinese classics. In particular, we can trace the first Latin translation of the Ta Xue to his hands. The second name, which was very, very well known in Europe, was that of the German Jesuit father von Bell, Johann Adam Schall von Bell, Adam Schall. Now, Schall was a scientist in particular, and he was employed by the officially by the emperor, and he produced a great deal of scientific work, most that talks about his own experiences in China when the dynasty was changed. So when the Ming gave way to the Qing. we will single it out for discussion a bit later. The name of this text is Cina Monumentis or Cina Illustrata. It's in Latin, and we will discuss it in quite some detail. We can skip the name of Adrien Grosselon about the again the story of the Qing takeover, and again focus on Intorceta's later Latin translation of the Zhongyong, itself further rendered into French, and most importantly on the work of these two people, Philippe Couplet, who was an editor of a major text, we'll talk about it in a while, and Ferdinand Verbiste. Couplet was French, Verbiste was Flemish. Verbiste is a scientist, and we will start with him, and then we'll get back to Couplet and focus a bit on his work. Before this, Von Bell or Adam Schall. Now, Schall, as I told you, wrote, as we shall soon see, even stranger peoples were imagined, in fact, to inhabit the lands further east. In countless, well, not quite countless, but quite a few documents in the 17th century in Mandarin official costume, right? So notice all the attributes of an astronomer, because that's what he was. He worked on the calendar and calculated, also made all sorts of complicated, fanciful, difficult calculations. Notice that there's a map over here, all sorts of instruments, a globe. All in all, he was a scholar, and we can see some of his scholarly production over here. This is a Jesuit-produced text on canon. In fact, Adam Schall worked on the actual production of guns, cannons, for the exact passage here sounds somewhat terrifying. Gets involved in the production of, well, cannon. We have a less belligerent object over here, just a telescope. This is part of a text specifically dedicated to telescopes that had been quite the rage in Europe for a while. Now we can move on now to Intorceta, the Italian father. This is a portrait of Intorceta that I like quite a lot, because it seems to me that well, obviously he wanted to be represented as a Chinese official, so he is carrying a fan with characters on them, so he looks very, very exotic. He presents himself as the representative of another state or of another culture to European eyes. This is a very beautiful portrait. I find it's part of a larger piece that is a bit hard to find. Slicing the bodies of their dead parents and then eating them are the covers of Intorceta's translations that were published in his lifetime. The general title of these translations was this dedicated to the political and moral science of the Chinese, the Sapientia Sinica, or the Sinarum Scientia. Basically, what is exciting is, again, the visual outlook, the way that knowledge is combined on the pages of the book. Because what we have here is the translated text that is, notice, very much the winged lion fighting. We have the Latin translation, and then we have the Chinese text with pronunciation next to them, right? So this would be the beginning, the famous beginning of the Zhongyong, right? As you can see over here. This way of combining Chinese knowledge with European languages or European language, the European language of science, Latin in particular, is going to create, well, is very, very typical for the early days of sinology. What is even more interesting is that these texts produced in Latin, quite a few of them acquired, not long after their publication, vernacular translations. So we have a translation into French, and this particular translation would be also, or some of these translations would be rendered from French into other languages, like into English, and so on and so forth. So what happens is that we have one general Latin language initial version that itself gets adopted into for wider readership into various local European languages. Again, what we have here is a more European style kind of page. So this looks Chinese, at least on its right hand side, right? So we have the Chinese text in columns with the European text disciplined a la européenne. The Icedonians eating their dead parents. Different a two-part division of the page, while here we have. Now, one important thing we need to understand is that finding in such accounts information that we today take as accurate is certainly possible. However, this is not what interests us here. Identifying geographical names, making sense of one passage or another, and the like. What is more important is to acknowledge the essential presence of such images built around the wonderful and the monstrous in the classical and later medieval maps, or maps of the mind, if you will. China, and this is a text that was produced in Europe, dedicated to what appears here to be as the Tartar grammar, that is the grammar of the Manchu language. This was published in an anthology, text edited quite a few years after it was initially written in 1696, but it was at least published. Now, I will skip quickly images from his various other scientific texts. Again, I have selected them for your enjoyment mostly, and also because they Verbiste represented a great deal of astronomical instruments actually produced and used by the Jesuits at the Chinese court in Beijing. Some of them can still be found there. They look like that. They were complicated instruments meant to calculate all sorts of things. The importance of astronomy for establishing the imperial calendar and hence the religious calendar was very, very significant. So the Jesuits are able to produce more accurate calculations and therefore icon. Highly prestigious positions at the Chinese court. Various instruments used for these purposes. This is dedicated to eclipses, and we can see here the text written both in Chinese, both in Latin, in Chinese, and in Manchu. So we have here a trilingual text. Notice how this looks. Pretty exciting, I would say, visually at least, plus the representation of the eclipse or whatever is happening during an eclipse. And this image of the Jesuit observatory in Beijing that can still be visited. Well, I think it's been reconstructed, but I forgot. But basically, this image was widely admired by Europeans and was going to be present in other texts in the century as well. Now, all these come from the encyclopedia, the short encyclopedia produced by Verbiste for imperial perusal, for imperial review. Now the text ends, so we have the text, and unlike other Jesuit productions, we don't have images included next to Chinese characters on the page. What we have is that we have the people with the umbrella style foot, and we can find them in all sorts of medieval manuscripts. We can actually see them here as well. Doesn't look like very weird to me. And then we have, guess what? Take a look. Our favorite animal in this class, or one of our favorite animals in this class, the unicorn. Just in case the Chinese didn't know about it yet. As you will see, they actually did. And then we have, well, mermaids. Ariel, or whatever her name is, was next to a whale, okay? So they come one after another. And finally, my favorite animal on the list, the giraffe. Now, you are going to ask, why exactly is it that this has managed to become my favorite animal? And here we are going to go on a tangent. I shouldn't really go on this tangent because it's going to take derived from Greek 5 minutes of this class, but I can't help it. And the reason is that I was curious about the giraffe as represented by the beast. So I started finding images of giraffes, and then I started finding out a great deal about the history of giraffe representations in China. That started significantly around the beginning of the 15th century, around the time when the Yongle Emperor received as a tribute from India or Asia or Africa or wherever, a giraffe. Now this giraffe stunned people, and it got represented by one major painter, and countless copies, not quite countless, but many copies were made after this particular representation. We have another one, so we have 2 or 3 editions of the giraffe. The reasons for all this being the fact that it was considered an auspicious animal. It was in fact considered to be a qilin. It's perhaps best to concentrate on the fact that the term itself refers to silk and the silk trade. The universe is happy with Yongle's coup d'etat, because basically he got power, as you know, by doing very bad things to his own family. So what we have here is a series of giraffe representations, many of them copies of the same original or copies after copies, and they all differ in small manners one from another. This is the one at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and then we have one image after one image after one image. Take a look at how this guy looks, how this guy looks, and how this guy looks. They are not quite the same. One of them is in the National Palace Museum in Taipei. This one over here. And then we have yet another giraffe, and yet another giraffe, and yet another giraffe. All these giraffes were collected on the internet. All these images were collected on the internet by a guy who turns out to be particularly obsessed with giraffes, among other things. I shared his obsession, so I was very happy that he had started collecting them a bit earlier than myself. I'm not sure exactly why he likes them so much, and I'm not sure why I like them so much. But the problem here is that he doesn't really give the source of some of his representations, so I don't really know, in quite a few cases, where exactly these can be found. Many of them, in fact, are circulate, so they are sold, they're in private hands. This one is not, and it's obviously a different representation of the same giraffe. This one is to be found in a museum in Chicago, and it went from private hands to a museum quite a long time ago. Finally, we have this, which is a bit more, which reverts, notice the exact positioning of the man and the giraffe. So here we have right-hand side man, left-hand side giraffe. Now we have this the other way round. We have it reversed. But still, let's call this trope number 1. Here they are kind of, engaged in a dialogue. Here they hate each other, probably after being represented over and over again. And finally, we have this particular giraffe in this particularly interesting text, which is unique. We have just this one copy of the world produced in China in Ming times that includes this image as well. Now this is, I think, the very last image of the giraffe that I collected for today. This was the tangent I engaged on. I kind of tried to stop, but I did, like scholars analyze them, they classify them, they try to do the genealogy of which is a copy of which. It's kind of interesting. I think there are giraffe fans, unacknowledged giraffe fans. Now I call myself one. Notice the title. Yeah, so this is a map. This is an image of a qilin. This is exactly what we have over here, right? The auspicious animal. This particular text over here has been translated by the crazy collector of giraffe images on the internet, so you can find them there for your enjoyment, explaining why this is auspicious, etc., etc., etc. Time to stop and move on to Verbeest and going back to his strange objects, right? So we are once again in the visual appendix of this text, and here he moves away from images of animals. We have a representation of a ship, and finally he moves to representing various European constructions, the most exciting of which are the 7 wonders of the ancient world. This would be the Colossus of Rhodes, and this would be the Colosseum in Rome, right? This is not really one of the wonders of the world, but it was represented there just in case. Now, this belongs to the larger visual production of Verbeest, who also produced this map in the tradition of Ricci that we have talked about and that we know a great deal of. This is a fascinating map. It's got its own long history that we don't really have time to discuss. This is for your enjoyment in case you feel like reading the text over here. All these maps are again, this is not, I cannot tell you all the things to submit to Roman authority, are not simple objects that we skip through, right? They tell many, many stories about their makers, about their agendas, about their dreams, about their wishes, about their desire, about many, many, many things, about their attempts at controlling reality. We have the same term, Seres, in both contexts. They objectify, etc., etc., etc. Notice that at the bottom on this particular exemplar we have mostly text, but here we start having other things, and these other things are animals. This is a black and white poor quality representation. Notice that we have the turkey over here, we are somewhere in the Americas here, but then we are on more familiar territory, and guess what we have here? I guess you can see it. I guess it's a giraffe. And guess what we have here? Oops, it's a unicorn. You can see these better, the giraffe and the unicorn next to other animals, more familiar ones. And this is the giraffe next to its text. The text has been translated, all the text on the map has been translated. There is a site specifically dedicated to the map, and this scholarly translation explains exactly why the giraffe looks away from the guy in those copies we discussed at the end. When a person looks upon it, the giraffe will calmly turn around as if to show off its splendid nature. I am so beautiful, look at me. Giraffe, the giraffe said. This would be the explanation over here. I confess to not having found this particular translation, this particular site immediately, and having spent quite a few enjoyable moments with my daughter trying to figure out the exact text, because the exact words like Ethiopia here, right, are kind of difficult to figure out at first, right? But it's easily legible and kind of fun. Anyways, finally we have the unicorn, which would be located in India. Over here we do have some information on the poisonous qualities or how the horn of the unicorn is used in order to fight poison. This is kind of connects a bit back to European knowledge. We have here different images of the same. Unfortunately, this is not legible. It's found somewhere in Australia in a library. But notice the beautiful blue giraffe, in case you are wondering. This is the giraffe in its blue period, Picasso style. This is a Korean copy of the same, where the blue is kind of less visible. We are moving towards a very fanciful leopard-like spotted unicorn over here. Now the unicorn looks even more fanciful in a kind of really weird color combination on this particular copy. Now this becomes weirder and weirder. They had no idea what they were talking about. They had no idea how these animals look like. Finally, we have the sirens, or the mermaids, described over here as being, they are fish. They are supposed to be fish, and the top half of its body looks like a man or a woman, while the bottom looks like the tail of a fish. Its bones can be used to treat blood illnesses, in case you're wondering. And the female siren can imitate many different sounds, as Odysseus's friends figured out by themselves quite quickly, and as well as many other people in the Greek myth. Finally, the opossum, located somewhere in Chile and looking very, very strange. Now, all these belong on that map that was produced over and over and reproduced over and over in China, and not only, as you noticed, in East Asia, many years after the beast first made it. We are moving to the next slide. The names included here are mostly French, for reasons that have to do with Louis XIV and his dialogue from afar with the Chinese Empire and the state sponsoring of the Jesuit mission. I'm not going to talk to you about all this because it's too complicated and long. Suffice it to remember that Philippe Couplet, a name we found on the previous name slide as well, together with Louis Lecomte and Bouvet, are among the most important sinologists and producers of knowledge about China at the end of the century. On the list we have also a Portuguese father. Now Couplet is very, very important in our discussion because he put together, with a long and very important introduction, all the translations of the classics, of the Chinese classics, produced by earlier fathers like Intorcheta and several others. This appeared in a very important and significant edition known as Confucius Sinarum Philosophus, or the Confucius, the Chinese philosopher. This was translated into French in abbreviated form. It has been translated into English, I think. It was translated a few years ago. So we have it in English, I think, for full perusal. It's very, very interesting. It's a very, very interesting document. It is a text that positions Confucius very, very highly. Also makes Confucianism religiously very, very compatible with Christianity. There's a lot to discuss about this, but we certainly do not have time. Suffice it to say that this was a highly influential text in the creation of the image of China as a open to Christianity and also philosophical land that the 18th century will inherit. I will skip the text on, or the information on Magalhães. The text appeared. He was Portuguese, but the text appeared in French, and then it was translated into English. And I will mention then the text of Louis Le Comte. Le Comte wrote at the very end of the century a text known as Nouveau Mémoire sur l'état présent. After a soaking in water, they come off the white down of the leaves, and so supply our women with the double task of unraveling the threads and weaving them together again. Text, it's shaped probably more than many other earlier texts, the ideas that Europeans carried with them, the books, if you would, that Europeans carried with them in their understanding of China in the next century. We'll discuss about this text at some length next week. But please do remember that together with Couplet and Bouvet, Le Comte represents one of the members of the, one of the most influential members of the French Jesuits at the end of the century. Today, I will just emphasize the visual component of both this and this text produced by Bouvet, which is dedicated to a kind of anthropological, short anthropology of China. Before that, take a look at this. This was on the frontispiece of the Confucius Sinarum Philosophus, and this particular representation of Confucius as a sage, kind of dominating with his person China and its knowledge, stuck to European image of China for quite a while. This is the cover of the Magalhães text, and we should stop here because I think it's break time as we will approach discussing Le Comte's visual parts, the visual parts in Le Comte's text. So please have your break.
Excuse me. Is the online forum #1 still open to be submitted?
No. So there's going to be a new forum coming up.
All right.
Probably very soon.
The system is not closed yet, so I thought.
Yeah, but there's a deadline, right? So I'm not closing it.
Yeah.
I don't want to do that, but basically I won't consider contributions there.
Okay. Okay, sure.
Yes?
I've sent you email about my attendance.
Yeah, so you are, please remind me, I don't remember. What was the problem?
I have an intern in China, so I just come back.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I didn't take the test.
Oh, you did not?
Yes. So can I do anything to for my
yes, you can. Let's discuss about this. I'll figure something out. Write an email to me again.
Okay.
Yeah, telling me about your situation, then I'll figure something out for you, right? You cannot take the test. I'll ask you to do some supplementary work or something along these lines, but do write to me so that I have the message there and it doesn't skip my mind. So the moment I receive your email, I'll reply and we'll figure something out. Do you have my email?
Oh, yes.
Yes? Okay.
I'll send you email.
Send it again. Okay. Or just tell me, okay, we discussed today, I'm the student who had the scholarship in China. Please send me some work to do, okay? Just so that I have your address over there, yeah? In the inbox.
And I want to know
Yes.
when is the next test?
Test. Well, do you have access to Moodle? You do?
Yeah, I have.
Well, the syllabus is there. So take a look at the syllabus, because I don't really know. Why? What's your problem? What?
Nothing. Yeah, I can say syllabus first.
Okay.
I think I saw syllabus, but I don't see any specific.
Yes, there is. Yes, there is. Right. So if you take a look at the syllabus, you'll notice that the tests are emphasized, appear in the text. Don't imagine that their geography was ours, and also remember that this is not what interests us primarily here. Yeah.
Are you going to get it back for like reference?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
So when are we getting it back?
Well, next week. Weren't you here when I started explaining? This is a fascinating account about silk making, correcting earlier stories about silk growing in trees. Its author is a Greek man by the name of Pausanias, who produced his description of Greece, a text that doesn't seem to have circulated much, in the 2nd century. Pausanias was also one of the several writers who took the land of the Ceres to be an island. But then again, he also mentions the possibility that the Ceres are in fact Ethiopians, and places their country somewhere in the Red Sea. You can read more about this by yourselves. We'll continue the discussion after the break, so please have your break. We ended our discussion with Pausanias and his text mentioning the silkworm and the production of silk, and so on and so forth, and that can be brought to the Christian fold, right? So if we analyze the exact images or what exactly gets represented, we also understand how such visual agendas can be read in relation to the texts they belong to. This is an analysis of the present state of China with very, very beautiful images. This is by Bouvet. Very, very beautiful images, again themselves worthy of being analyzed. In the 11th century, was later translated from Arabic into Latin and circulated widely in manuscript form before being printed in the 16th century. Military official, while this would be a civil official, so a military person, a administrative person, both of them one next to another, actually not one next to another, but one image after another. Then the ladies, Chinese ladies. This would be Manchu women, represented separately from the Chinese ladies. The Manchu men, a prince here, and that would be an official. So notice that in European texts of the time, that talk about the Manchurian Christian tenets territory, the Chinese and the Manchu are represented in keeping with realities as belonging to two different layers, two different areas, two different places, and so on and so forth. Now, this is just a selection. There are much many more images worth discussing, but we are now skipping to a very exciting topic that fascinated European minds at that time, and that I will need to sum up as quickly as possible, and in relation to which China will ultimately turn important as well. The topic is the universal language. The idea that a universal language has either existed or can exist again. A universal language allowing people from all over the world to communicate, like in the times before God decided to punish humans into English, put down the Tower of Babel that foolish people decided to build in order to challenge God. This is a very... The Seres are meek and very quiet among themselves, but otherwise they eschew the company of all men besides, insomuch that they refuse to have any traffic or intercourse of merchandise with other nations. You can read the rest of the passage by yourselves if you enjoy Elizabethan English. Humans spoke one single language. It was the language of God, because it was the language spoken by Adam and Eve. It was the language spoken by everybody until this very horrible moment in history when humans decided to challenge God and decided to build this building, and God himself, while very much a compiler of older sources himself, them by tearing down their tower and by making their language many, into many, right? The multiplication of human languages, right? This is the biblical explanation of the reasons why humans speak so many languages. So of course, this project involves either discovering this primitive, early, God inspired human language, or on a different dimension, creating one. Why all this was happening at that particular time? There are many reasons. The most important one being listed here. Most important ones being listed here. After 1492, when America was discovered in time, but we can also say a bit earlier, probably at the beginning of the 15th century, the world was becoming a much larger place. And Europeans were learning a great deal of many other things they had no idea about. Becoming a much larger place, Europeans were confronted with many new languages, many new idioms, many new cultures, many things that challenged the traditional biblical inspired understanding of human culture. Then Europeans tried to make sense of all this, and because the Bible was produced by God, it's a sacred text that cannot be contradicted, the new realities discovered had to be made fit into, well, the biblical story. So the new realities had to be domesticated in keeping with the European understanding of the world. Another thing that is important. Religiously, the Europeans were confronted with all sorts of different peoples. Some of these people seemed ripe for conversion, seemed to be easily it seemed to Europeans that they could easily make them into Christians. Accordingly, it was believed that this might have something to do with the kind of primitive natural ability of humans to acknowledge the truths of Christian religions without being Christian. This would happen because of their ability to kind of have a memory of a primitive language or of a primitive culture that the Europeans, the Christian Europeans, felt it was their duty to rediscover, find anew. All this was happening at a time when the European idioms themselves were multiplying, culturally speaking. That is, languages like English and French and Spanish and Portuguese were... This comes from a 6th century text by Procopius, and it tells the story of how silk production was famously started in Europe once a group of monks brought silkworms to Byzantium from the east. We don't really learn anything new about the Seres, but the passage is certainly interesting to read even if we don't have time to go through it in detail now. Fascinating endeavor. This is the beginning of many studies in Europe of non-European languages. Here we have the first Arabists, for instance, people studying Arabic, people studying Hebrew. This already had like a long history, but now this is becoming more scientific, and so on and so forth. The first grammars, the first dictionaries. It's a long story, but to simplify things, late Renaissance linguistic conscience is strong, very strong. All this against this background of changes that was happening. Finally, or generally, again in late Renaissance, we are in a period when religious texts and texts in general are read more freely. There is more room for interpretation, and people like, for instance, like Erasmus of Rotterdam works on texts, getting involved in what is known as textual criticism, comparing manuscripts, putting linguistic data together. Again, all this strongly supports investigations, cultural, linguistic or otherwise, but rather narrates events that actually happened in Chinese history. Specifically, northern China, before the Sui dynasty, was established in 581. The descriptive parts include many exciting aspects, and there are also connections to Alexander the Great's Asian campaigns. Moreover, we can also find a few of the tropes we have learned about so far. This is interesting in the sense that it shows us how knowledge of the Middle Ages, so to say. Now, against this background, we have the very first texts that contribute. We learn here about the justice of the people in that area. The names, except perhaps that of Bishop Ussher, who in the 1650s produced the text among many others that was going to be the most important in calculating the beginnings of the world. Why would that be such an important thing? Why would Europeans become obsessed with finding out exactly when the world was produced? Well, because the Bible does contain a historical account of things. It discusses the lifespan of various characters, who lived how many years or hundreds of years. We know of Methuselah, who lived like 900 years or so. So people in the 17th century tried to find out, going from the present moment back in time, as to when exactly the world was created and what was the exact historical succession of the creation of the world. Now, many people became interested in this kind of biblical chronology for reasons we will see on the next slide. But before we do that, let us notice that Bishop Ussher, good Bishop Ussher, decided that the world itself, that God created the world on the nightfall preceding Sunday, October the 23rd, in the year 4004 BC. Okay? Unfortunately, he doesn't give the exact moment, like, 7:45 or whatever p.m., but basically this kind of tells us the kind of intellectual adventure, the kind of intellectual quests that people in the 17th century were interested in making. To us, this may seem like a ridiculous endeavor, but do notice that the Bible represented, or still represented, the absolute sacred text that gave a vision of the world as it is, and that could not be challenged. Now, who was challenging? These were challenging it. People like Martino Martini wrote, and I mentioned this a bit earlier, a text on Chinese history, large-scale text on Chinese history, that basically introduced Chinese historical knowledge to European audiences. It was written by a Jesuit father, so it couldn't be a lie. But the problem is that such a text seemed, through the very antiquity of the names it mentioned, so such a text seemed to challenge the biblical narrative. How could the Chinese be so old? That was a problem. And how could they not be mentioned in the Bible at all if they are so old? That tantalized and challenged European minds. On the one hand, the Bible couldn't be contradicted. On the other hand, we have the Chinese, and they are old, and the Bible doesn't talk about them. We need to address this issue. We need to make the biblical chronology clear, and hence Bishop Ussher and his fanciful creation of the world. And we also the ocean surrounding the inhabited earth. T and O also refer to the Latin expression orbis terrarum, the orb or the circle of the earth. And I will mention again, and mostly by John Webb. John Webb, who wrote a beautiful text, we'll talk about it in a short while, an historical essay endeavoring the probability that the language of the Empire of China is the primitive language. To put it otherwise, that Adam and Eve saw each other and said, Ni hao. Now, all this involved, before we even address this issue, matching chronologies. So finding biblical characters and identifying them with characters mentioned in the Chinese chronicles. And here we have a few examples that may look to us like completely out of control, but were taken very, very seriously by people of the time. For example, the Chinese histories mentioned the Emperor Fushi. Now, who is this guy? Well, of course, it's Adam himself. It's just that, you know, the Chinese couldn't pronounce the word Adam because, you know, they lost it. Notice that the map also mentions the Ceres over here. This comes from a text produced in the 8th century, with the manuscript shown here made a few centuries later. It's Adam, then Nua must be Eve. Aha! And we can move on. Shen Nong would be Cain, and Huang Ti would be Cain's son, and Emperor Yao is Noah, the guy with the flood, and so on and so forth. So what basically all these people who wrote significantly in dialogue, so they kind of contradicted each other and said, how can you say that Adam is Fushi? No, Fushi must be the other guy. All these people were debating such issues at some length. Notice that this continued to happen all the way, at least until the 1730s, when Christian Bayer was still writing about such issues. Fun or not, this is part of Europe's intellectual attempt at making sense of a different world, of a world that did not fit the Bible. Okay? It was outside the Bible. So, one-eyed people fighting winged lions. Here horribly. The story is much more complicated. There are different versions of the Bible. In some versions of the Bible, chronologies look different, and so on and so forth, and so on and so forth. It's long, it's complicated, it's lovely, it's crazy. It's part, again, of the European heritage, intellectual heritage. Against all this, finally, the actual quest. A famous Psalter map. The list contains many, many, many names. Those in red tend to be more, or I find them more important. Mostly, we have here very respectable philosophers like Francis Bacon, educators like Comenius, and finally, very strange, interesting scholars like John Wilkins, who is trying to invent a philosophical language together with several other people in the 1650s, 1660s, 1670s, to recreate to create a universal language. And finally, the text we are mostly interested in, John Webb's idea of Chinese being the original language spoken by people. So what we should all do is, obviously, if we want to communicate easily, is all of us learn Chinese and abandon our idioms. I'm not going to mention all these names. All of them are fascinating. All of them are interesting. Let's move on. I will skip the beautiful images dedicated to the Tower of Babel. It's interesting to notice when a great deal of such images were produced. Of course, we have earlier medieval Wikipedia is quite useful for identifying places on the map. At the center of the map, here, we have Jerusalem and the crucifix. The paradise is located over there, and up over here we have the Caspian Sea and the land of Gog and Magog. I'll explain a bit later what this is about. Do not have time. He was an architect, etc. But basically, he just wrote this little essay trying to tell us, forget about anything else, Chinese is what you're looking for. Now, 75% of his book is primarily dedicated to demonstrating how characters in Chinese history match characters in the Bible, in the style I just mentioned with Fushi and Adam and so on and so forth. The other 20%, sorry, it's not YouTube. The links takes you to a different site. 25% is dedicated to showing how and why Chinese is the universal, primitive, early language spoken by humans, given to humans by God. The very first argument he produces is the fact that Chinese is a natural language. To us, this may seem like a normal thing. Like, what do you mean a natural language? Well, for some scholars like Gorlius, I mentioned his name 2 weeks ago, but forget about him. They believe that it had been purposefully invented by people. So it was kind of a thing that was an artifice, was created it didn't develop naturally like all human languages. It was like a system put together by humans for specific purposes. Now, his very first point is that no, this is like a natural language, like every single language, and we notice that this, or we can testify to its being a natural language by the fact that it is a language that is really, really simple. It's really got very little grammar. It's very close to a not sophisticated linguistic creature that humans would normally produce when left to their own devices, kind of thing. Now, what does this mean? It means that the older trope of Chinese having no grammar, having little rhetoric, as he says, or little logic, is revived. People didn't travel like we do. People read books, or people heard stories. And it is from these books, or from these stories, that they produced such visions of the world. It's many, many cases, and I don't know, German with all these declensions or whatever, right? No. They would produce a language like Chinese. Simple, immediate, no grammar, everybody can learn it on the spot. He builds then his points by relying on a great many texts from the sinological literature of his time. He refers to very recent texts, so the man did his homework. So he was reading everything, and entered dialogue with scholars of his time at some length. Now, he suggests basically 6 criteria to check whether Chinese is the primitive language, universal language at all. So he discusses the antiquity of Chinese, its simplicity, its generality, its modesty of expression, its utility, and its brevity. Next to this, he takes into account the scholarly arguments for each and every one of them. Now, we don't have really time to review all his arguments, but they are really funny. For example, simplicity. Yeah, so Chinese is a simple language. How are you going to demonstrate this? So again, guest students here who are studying Chinese, take heart. Look at what Webb is saying. So, how do we know Chinese is simple? Well, we know that it doesn't have all sorts of complicated flexionary forms. It doesn't have foreign words in it. It cannot really, express the foreign. It doesn't have the R sound, something that Europeans had noticed for a long time. And finally, my favorite argument runs like this. And as if all things conspired to prove this is the primitive tongue, we may observe how forcibly nature struggles to demonstrate so much. More specifically, the very first expression we make of life at the very instant minute of our birth is, as was touched on before, by uttering the Xinique word or the Chinese word ya. To put it otherwise, when the babies get born and they say wah, the very first cry, that's a Chinese word. Okay? So the very first human sound defeated all sorts of people there in the Caucasus area or maybe elsewhere, somewhere far away from our world, in the lands of wonder and monsters. I don't know. So basically that's how we know. Moreover, which is not only the first, but indeed the sole and only expression that mankind from nature can justly lay claim unto, because at that moment children are not part of any culture, right? So this is, they speak their own given language, which would be Chinese. Then the language of China, as has been syllables. And in our infancy, the very first notions of speech we have are all monosyllables. As for instance, ta for father, ma for mother, pa for brother, the like happening in all other terms. With all these are of course Chinese words, or at least they are monosyllables, like, as we all know, it was, and let its inhabitants take over civilization was there. Finally put together into a long, into a complicated and wonderful, in fact, text dedicated to demonstrating exactly this. One thing that I also particularly like is the fact that in Chinese people don't swear. So don't say they don't have dirty words, they don't say bad things at all. So of course this must be the primitive language. Hebrew had been considered a candidate, but unfortunately Hebrew was known a bit better at that time, and showing the gates, or rather a sort of cage keeping monsters away. About how Chinese could contain bad words as well. Okay, and so on and so forth. I can warmly, and I will warmly recommend this text for your enjoyment. It is in English. It's not difficult to read. I think it's been translated into Chinese as well. It's a wonderful little text that makes perfect sense against the background it was produced, against all this search for the universal language. The search hasn't stopped, in case you are wondering, right? So languages have continued to be invented. Attempts at universal communication haven't died, but that's a different story, and it's not time for us to express it. But anyway, once again, let's take heart in the possibility of Chinese being the primitive language spoken by the very earliest forefathers, ancestors of humans. Time for Kircher, a text that I mentioned already, a person that I mentioned several times already, and his particular text known as China Monumentis or China Illustrata is 67. Wonderful, wonderful, crazy collection of knowledge on China. Now, Kircher has been dubbed the last man who knew everything, or one ill-intended individual might say, who knew nothing. He was a scholar, a professor in Rome, a person who wrote many texts on a large variety of topics, on acoustics, hieroglyphs, universal language, geology, medical studies, music, magnetism, numerology, and God knows what. Not only did he write on all these things, but he produced lavish, enormously expensive tomes, books, beautifully illustrated, spectacular texts. He had very rich patrons to pay for these editions, and therefore many of his texts had very fanciful and long dedications. Kircher is the representative of an older way of mastering the world. Science as a way of knowledge, as a new epistemological way was being put together. Kircher represented like medieval, early Renaissance kind of knowledge. Basically, he wanted to make sense of the world, explaining away through. His kingdom was supposed to be located correspondence, every little aspect, every single aspect of reality. He also put together one of the earliest, museums in Europe that collected countless objects brought to him from all over the world, including from China. He was a Jesuit. He never traveled to China, but he knew everybody. Everybody visited him. If they didn't know each other, they had a correspondence. So he was part of a larger network of knowledge, and it was on the basis of such information that he built his synthesis, his large-scale synthesis. How wrong was he in all his scientific endeavors? Many times fundamentally wrong. A few times some of his insights have stood the test of time. So some of the things that he talks about still make sense for us. Not in keeping with the context he put them into, but still they do make sense. The letter was supposed to have been sent by the Prester to a Byzantine emperor. Because of this, such a word had to explain away everything. Okay? There couldn't be anything left there without being given a reason, without being given an explanation to. We can see books. This is just a collection of covers or illustrations in his books. They are here just for your enjoyment. I won't analyze them, but basically notice how much the famous cult of the Baroque, we are in the Baroque period in European arts, the famous Baroque cult of the symmetry and of the spectacle of creating spectacular, well-ordered, symmetrical representations is obvious here. They are absolutely wonderful. You can find there's a revival in Kircher studies that has been going on for 20-30 years now, mostly since many of his texts have become mentions a conflict between Prester John and the Mongol ruler, and Odoric of Pordenone talks about his traveling through the lands of the Prester on his return voyage to Europe in the early 14th century. Later, the Portuguese, as well as other people, would is everywhere. We can see here kind of scientific objects that he imagined. Some of them do make sense, like for instance this would be like kind of a sound amplifier that he produced. But notice also the very complicated, fantastic compositions giving access to all sorts of lost knowledge that a scholar like himself would be able to reveal anew to his contemporaries. I love the man. I do love him. He is quite in this 15th century map. One of them, but do take your moments at home perhaps and look at these images just for their sheer beauty. They testify to the existence of a very different world that is long gone. We don't have it anymore. In point of fact, there are people today who do Kirchherize as well, but I really don't have time to go on this tangent. That would take us much too long. But you know, Kircherizing is kind of an intellectual adventure. I'm using this verb to Kirchherize because scholars actually created it, right? To be a Kircher person, to treat knowledge like Kircher. Therefore, to Kirchherize. Yeah? The verb exists. You can find it and have fun with it, right? So there are people who Kirchherize today as well. Look at this beautiful symmetrical representation. Look at this huge tree with a Jesuit at its root. Finally, because he wanted to have patrons, it was important for him to have rich patrons, he dedicated his texts to them, and he had such dedications translated into different languages, including Chinese, just in order to show off. So this particular book has about, 40 dedications produced in one single language after one single language. So imagine Greek alphabet, Russian alphabet, all sorts of Arabic, Hebrew, Persian, written in Arabic, Indian languages, God knows what. Finally, some Chinese over here. All of them one after another, dedicating the text to, whatever, Duke, Habsburg Duke or King or whatever, right? It's basically, this tells us what? That Kircher knows all these things, right? So I know all these languages. I'm so smart. I'm going to give you truth. So pay me 600,000 kwai or something to publish this book, right? This was the kind of thing that was happening, right? He was very, very smart. And basically, he also advertised himself, right? So at the end of, one public, Kievan Russ, in my next book, you are going to find this and that. So basically, stay tuned. My text on Egyptology is going to come up in 1 year. Then series 2 in 1644. If you pay more, then I'm going to give you one on China as well. And that's exactly what happened when he put together this compilation of knowledge about China from basically Jesuit sources, many of them, and Jesuit reports. It's a 5-part book, which is fascinating in and of itself. It exists. It was translated. It was written in Latin. It was translated into French. It was pirated. It was so popular that it was pirated by Dutch printers. So we have authorized edition and pirated editions like DVDs today. At that time, they used to pirate books. There is an English translation, partial English translation, and now there's a full English translation also available. You can have a lot of fun reading it. There are many, many parts worth our time here. Mostly, we should emphasize this part, which discusses the European experience of China, the various roads taken to China. So a review of travelers and the knowledge they brought on their way from Europe to China. Also the curious things of China, all sorts of things that excited him and he thought they were worth commenting on, like politics, cities, mountains, animals, plants, fish, snakes, stones, and so on and so forth. This is my favorite part, apart from the very last, which is dedicated to Chinese characters and which absolutely wonderful. And the reason why this is wonderful is that Kircher, did his best, which was to Kircherize. And in his Kircherization process, he basically decided to demonstrate that China was nothing less but a colony of ancient Egypt. That would explain all sorts of historical accidents. That would explain the Chinese language, the Chinese writing. So basically, he tried to demonstrate this among the many other people that would try to do the same a bit later. Of course, this would make Chinese characters deriving from Egyptian hieroglyphs. And we can see this absolutely at first sight because we can easily realize that this which are like the ancient Chinese characters, are they look like hieroglyphic characters found on Roman obelisks, on obelisks from Egypt available in Rome, and we can find the same in the actual present. They were worth commenting on, like politics, cities, mountains, animals, plants, fish, snakes, stones, and so on and so forth. This is my favorite part, apart from the very last, which is dedicated to Chinese characters and which absolutely wonderful. And the reason why this is wonderful is that Kircher, well, did his best, which was to Kircherize. And in his Kircherization process, he basically decided to demonstrate that China was nothing less but a colony of ancient Egypt. That would explain all sorts of historical accidents. That would explain the Chinese language, the Chinese writing. So basically, he tried to demonstrate this among the many other people that would try to do the same a bit later. Of course, this would make Chinese characters deriving from Egyptian hieroglyphs, and we can see this absolutely at first sight because we can easily realize that these, which are like the ancient Chinese characters, are hieroglyphic, they look like hieroglyphic characters found on Roman obelisks, on obelisks from Egypt available in Rome, and we can find the same in the actual present. They were worth commenting on, like politics, cities, mountains, animals, plants, fish, snakes, stones, and so on and so forth. This is my favorite part, apart from the very last, which is dedicated to Chinese characters and which absolutely wonderful. And the reason why this is wonderful is that Kircher, well, did his best, which was to Kircherize. And in his Kircherization process, he basically decided to demonstrate that China was nothing less but a colony of ancient, related to some lands over there, language, the Chinese writing. So basically, he tried to demonstrate this among the many other people that would try to do the same a bit later. Of course, this would make Chinese characters deriving from Egyptian hieroglyphs, and we can see this absolutely at first sight because we can easily realize that these, which are like the ancient Chinese characters, are hieroglyphic, they look like hieroglyphic characters found on Roman obelisks, on obelisks from Egypt available in Rome, and we can find the same in the actual present. They were worth commenting on, like politics, cities, mountains, animals, plants, fish, snakes, stones, and so on and so forth. This is my favorite part, apart from the very last, which is dedicated to Chinese characters and which absolutely wonderful. And the reason why this is wonderful is that Kircher, well, did his best, which was to Kircherize. And in his Kircherization process, he basically decided to demonstrate that China was nothing less but a colony of ancient Egypt, related to some lands over there, Chinese language, the Chinese writing. So basically, he tried to demonstrate this among the many other people that would try to do the same a bit later. Of course, this would make Chinese characters deriving from Egyptian hieroglyphs, and we can see this absolutely at first sight because we can easily realize that these, which are like the ancient Chinese characters, are hieroglyphic, they look like hieroglyphic characters found on Roman obelisks, on obelisks from Egypt available in Rome, and we can find the same in the actual present. They were worth commenting on, like politics, cities, mountains, animals, plants, fish, snakes, stones, and so on and so forth. This is my favorite part, apart from the very last, which is dedicated to Chinese characters and which absolutely wonderful. And the reason why this is wonderful is that Kircher, well, did his best, which was to Kircherize. And in his Kircherization process, he basically decided to demonstrate that China was nothing less but a colony of ancient. So what looks like at least partially accurate information about the Cathayans or the Chinese, among the many other people that would try to do the same a bit later. Of course, this would make Chinese characters deriving from Egyptian hieroglyphs, and we can see this absolutely at first sight because we can easily realize that these, which are like the ancient Chinese characters, are hieroglyphic, like they look like hieroglyphic characters. Found on Roman obelisks, on obelisks from Egypt available. The passage, notice, talks about reports he heard about the dog heads. But since such reports confirm the law he must have been familiar with, it's still a question of background books, all in all. In Rome, and absolutely wonderful. And the reason why this is wonderful is that Kircher, well, did his best, which was China was nothing less but a colony of ancient Egypt. So what looks like at least partially accurate information about the Cathayans or the Chinese is among the many other people that would try to do the same a bit later. Of course, this would make Chinese characters deriving from Egyptian hieroglyphs, and we can see this absolutely at first sight. Because we can easily realize that these, which are like the ancient Chinese characters, are hieroglyphic, like they look like hieroglyphic characters. Found on Roman obelisks, on obelisks from Egypt. The passage, notice, talks about reports he heard about the dog heads. But since such reports confirm the law he must have been familiar with, it's still a question of background books, all in all. Available in Rome, and absolutely wonderful. And by another compiler of a major encyclopedia, Roger Bacon. So what looks like at least partially accurate information about the Cathayans or the Chinese is among the many other people that would try to do the same a bit later. Of course, this would make Chinese characters deriving from Egyptian hieroglyphs, and we can see this absolutely at first sight. Because we can easily realize that these, which are like the ancient Chinese characters, are hieroglyphic, like they look like hieroglyphic characters. Found on Roman obelisks, on obelisks from Egypt. The passage, notice, talks about reports he heard about the dog heads. But since such reports confirm the law he must have been familiar with, it's still a question of background books, all in all. Available in Rome, and absolutely wonderful. And the reason why by another compiler of a major encyclopedia, Roger Bacon. Colony of ancient Egypt. So what looks like at least partially accurate information about the Cathayans or the Chinese is among the many other people that would try to do the same a bit later. Of course, this would make Chinese characters deriving from Egyptian hieroglyphs, and we can see this absolutely at first sight. Because we can such visions are hieroglyphic, like they look like characters found on Roman obelisks, on obelisks from Egypt. The passage, notice, talks about reports he heard about the dog head. He's never too keen on choosing one view of background books, another available in Rome, and the reason why by another compiler of a major the stories he carried with him from Europe of ancient Egypt. So what looks like at least partially accurate information about the Cathayans or the Chinese is among the many other people that would try to do the same a bit later. Of course, this would make Chinese characters deriving from Egyptian hieroglyphs, and we can see this absolutely at first sight. Because we can easily such visions, Chinese characters as made up of various strokes or elements that the Europeans had. Found on Roman obelisks, on obelisks from Egypt. The passage, notice, talks about reports he heard about 1500 years or more of European perceptions of China, mostly central of Asia, mostly Central and East Asia, look like. Much lore, much of what we would describe as imagination. The stories he carried with him from Europe, colony of ancient Egypt. So what looks like at least partially accurate information about the Cathayans or the Chinese is among the many other people that would try to do the same a bit later. Of course, this would make Chinese characters deriving from Egyptian hieroglyphs, and we can see this absolutely at first sight. Here, and then he uses agricultural letters that he represents like this, and all sorts of fantastic categories looking like this, with sometimes present day Chinese characters included at the bottom of each image. You will ask yourselves, where did he get all this? And the answer is from popular encyclopedias in Ming times. Also,